Picture a city, not a battlefield, not a ruin, a city, a living, breathing metropolis of 1 million souls. Street vendors selling hot dumplings in the morning fog, children running along the banks of the Yangtze River, merchants arguing over prices in crowded markets, temple bells echoing across tiled rooftops. A city that had stood for centuries, that had been a capital of empires, a seat of dynasties, a cradle of Chinese civilization. Now imagine that city on a specific night. December 13th, 1937. The vendors are gone. The children are hiding. The merchants are dead. The streets are silent, except for gunshots, except for screaming, except for the crackling roar of buildings that have been set on fire just to watch them burn. In the next 6 weeks, historians estimate somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 people will die in this city. Not on a battlefield, in their homes, in alleyways, on riverbanks, in schools that had been turned into refugee camps, in temples that were supposed to be sanctuaries. The city is Nanking, and what happened here is one of the most documented, most debated, and most devastating atrocities in all of human history. This is not a story that's easy to tell. It's not a story that's easy to hear. But it is a story that must be told, because the people who lived it, who survived it, who died in it, deserve to be more than a footnote. They deserve witnesses. So stay with me, because we are going to go into that darkness together. And on the other side of it, we will understand something essential about what human beings are capable of, and what a small handful of extraordinary people did to push back. This is the Nanking Massacre, the world before the storm. To understand how a modern army could descend into something that looked more like medieval slaughter than 20th century warfare, you have to understand the pressures that had been building for years in Japan, in China, and in the fragile, explosive relationship between them. Let's start with Japan. By the early 1930s, Japan was a nation that had modernized at an almost impossible speed. In less than a century, it had transformed itself from a feudal island nation into an industrial and military power capable of standing alongside Britain, France, and the United States on the world stage. And that transformation had come at a price, a deep, festering sense of national pride, racial superiority, and imperial ambition. Japanese ultranationalists believed their nation was destined to dominate Asia. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a term that sounded almost enlightened if you didn't look too closely. What it meant in practice was simple. Japan would rule, and everyone else would serve. The military wasn't just powerful in Japan. It was revered. Soldiers were raised from birth on a code of Bushido, a warrior's philosophy that placed honor, obedience, and fearlessness above all else, including life itself. Surrender was considered the deepest shame imaginable. To die for the emperor was the highest calling. And the emperor, Hirohito, was not merely a head of state. He was considered divine, a living god. In this culture, orders from above were not questioned. They were obeyed. And the men who gave those orders had been feeding soldiers a steady diet of propaganda that painted the Chinese as subhuman, as inferior people who needed to be conquered, not respected. Now let's look at China. China in the 1930s was the opposite of Japan in almost every way. Where Japan was unified under a single imperial vision, China was fractured, chaotic, and bleeding from multiple wounds at once. The Qing dynasty had collapsed in 1912, and what replaced it was not a strong republic, but a patchwork of competing warlords, each controlling their own territory, answerable to no one. Into this vacuum stepped Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. Chiang was a shrewd, complex man. He had studied military strategy in the Soviet Union. He had suppressed warlords, unified large portions of China under his government, and established Nanking, the old imperial capital, as his seat of power. But his control was always precarious, because running alongside him and against him were the Chinese communists, led by the young Mao Zedong. Chiang and Mao hated each other with a ferocity that sometimes seemed to overshadow the threat from Japan. In 1934, Chiang's nationalist forces nearly wiped out the communists entirely, forcing them on the legendary Long March, a 6,000-mile retreat through mountains and swamps that killed tens of thousands, but also forged the Communist Party into something harder, leaner, and more determined. So when Japan began probing Chinese territory in the early 1930s, China was already exhausted from fighting itself. The first strike came in 1931 in Manchuria, the vast, resource-rich region in northeastern China. Japanese military officers, acting without official authorization from Tokyo, or so they claimed, staged an explosion on a railway line near the city of Mukden. They blamed the Chinese. They used it as a pretext to invade. The Chinese government protested to the League of Nations. The League condemned Japan. Japan ignored the condemnation, withdrew from the League of Nations entirely, and went right on building its puppet state of Manchukuo. Chiang, knowing his military couldn't match Japan's, chose not to fight. He accepted the humiliation. That decision haunted him, because it told Japan something crucial: China would back down. For 6 years after Manchuria, tensions simmered. Japan pushed further into northern China through coercion and manipulation. Chinese citizens grew increasingly furious. Chiang's government grew increasingly untenable. Here was a leader who asked his people to be patient while Japan took piece after piece of their country. Then came the night of July 7th, 1937, just outside Beijing, then called Beiping. On a stone bridge that had stood for 800 years, a Japanese soldier went missing during a night exercise. It was a minor incident, possibly nothing more than a soldier who had wandered off to relieve himself. But the Japanese commanders on the ground used it to make escalating demands of the Chinese garrison nearby. The Chinese refused. Shots were fired. A skirmish erupted. And in the days that followed, both sides rushed reinforcements to the area. The Marco Polo Bridge incident, as it came to be called, was the spark that finally set the continent ablaze. The Second Sino-Japanese War, a conflict that would eventually fold into World War II and kill an estimated 20 million people, had begun. Chiang Kai-shek, facing immense pressure from the Chinese public, made a decision that surprised everyone, including his enemies. He reached out to Mao Zedong. The two men who had been trying to destroy each other for years agreed to form a united front against Japan. He stood before his people and declared that the limits of endurance had been reached. China would fight. Japan smiled. They had been hoping for this. They believed the war would be over in 3 months. They were wrong about almost everything that came next. The battle that broke an army's soul. The Japanese strategy was simple and brutal. Strike at Shanghai, China's largest and most internationally visible city. Take it quickly. Demonstrate to the world and to Chiang's government that resistance was futile. Force a surrender, then dictate terms. What happened instead was 3 months of hell that neither side expected. Shanghai in 1937 was unlike any other city in Asia. It was a place where East met West in spectacular and chaotic fashion. a city of jazz clubs and opium dens, French boulevards and ancient temples, international banks, and crowded Chinese slums. It was home to millions. It was watched by the world. And Chiang Kai-shek decided to make his stand there. He committed his best troops, his elite German-trained divisions, personally overseen by German military advisors, to the defense of Shanghai. His reasoning was strategic and political in equal measure. He knew he probably couldn't hold the city indefinitely, but a long, bloody fight in Shanghai would serve two purposes. It would draw international attention to Japan's aggression, and it would buy time for the inland provinces to prepare. What nobody predicted was just how long and how bloody that fight would become. The Japanese threw everything at Shanghai: naval bombardments, air raids, amphibious assaults, wave after wave of infantry, and the Chinese, against all expectation, refused to break. They fought for every building, every alley, every canal, street by street, room by room. The urban warfare was savage beyond description. Eyewitness accounts from the time speak of trenches running red, of streets so thick with bodies that soldiers struggled to advance, of artillery barges that turned neighborhoods to rubble in hours. A journalist who was there described the scene as something out of the Western Front in the First World War, industrialized slaughter on an almost incomprehensible scale. By the time Shanghai finally fell in November 1937, after 3.5 months of combat, the human cost was staggering. Chinese military casualties may have reached 250,000, many of them Chiang's best-trained, best-equipped soldiers. Irreplaceable men. Japan had expected to lose perhaps 10,000 troops. Instead, they lost 40,000, maybe more. The victory was hollow, and the mood of the Japanese army that had won it was not triumphant. It was furious. These men had been told this would be easy. They had been told the Chinese would fold. Instead, they had watched their friends die in urban warfare for 3 months. They had been humiliated by an enemy they had been conditioned to see as inferior. And now, as they marched inland toward Nanking through the cold December air, that humiliation had curdled into something dark and vengeful. The march itself became a horror show. Commanders looked the other way or actively encouraged what their soldiers did to the towns and villages along the route. The justifications were thin or non-existent. Any man might be a guerrilla. Any woman might be hiding a soldier. Any building might be a military asset. The reality was simpler and uglier. An army that had been brutalized was brutalizing others. Towns along the Yangtze River Delta were torched. Civilians were executed in mass groups. Rape became common. Soldiers competed in cruelties. By the time the advance columns reached the outskirts of Nanking in early December, they carried with them a momentum of violence, a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked and unpunished for weeks. And what was waiting for them at the end of that march was a city of 500,000 people with nowhere to go. There's something I want you to hold in your mind as we move into the next part of this story. Something a military historian once wrote that I think gets to the heart of what was happening. Atrocity is rarely born fully formed. It grows. It escalates. And every time it goes unpunished, it grows a little more. By December 1937, this particular atrocity had been growing for weeks. What happened in Nanking wasn't an aberration. It was the culmination. The city that was left behind. As Japanese forces tightened their grip around Nanking in late November and early December, the city began to empty. Chiang Kai-shek and the top echelons of his government were the first to go, relocating the capital upriver to Chongqing, a city so deep in the mountainous interior that Japanese forces couldn't easily reach it. His departure was controversial. Some called it strategic necessity. Others called it abandonment. The wealthy and the connected followed. Boats on the Yangtze were commandeered. Roads west became choked with columns of refugees. People carrying what they could on their backs, pushing carts, carrying children. Japanese aircraft strafed the river crossings. Boats overloaded with desperate people capsized. The exact number who died in those waters simply trying to flee is unknown, but witnesses described seeing bodies floating downstream for days. By December, approximately a quarter of the city's original population remained, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people. Most were the poorest residents, the ones who had nowhere else to go. The sick and elderly who couldn't make the journey. Families who had waited too long. Workers with no connections to people who could help them escape. They were trapped, and almost everyone who understood what was coming knew it. Which brings us to one of the most extraordinary stories within this larger story. A story that, without several remarkable individuals, would have had an even darker ending. In the weeks before the city fell, a small group of foreigners decided not to leave. Let me say that again, because it's important. While everyone who could escape was running for their lives, these people, about 20 Western businessmen, doctors, professors, and missionaries, made a conscious decision to stay. Their reasoning varied. Some were driven by religious conviction, some by professional duty, some by a simple, stubborn refusal to abandon the people they had lived and worked among for years. But together, they formed a committee, the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone, and they hatched an audacious plan. They would carve out a neutral zone within the city, a designated safe area roughly 4 square kilometers in the western part of Nanking, marked with Red Cross flags and signs. They would move civilians into this zone, and they would use their status as foreign nationals, citizens of countries not yet at war with Japan, as a shield. The chairman of this committee was a man whose background was almost paradoxically suited to the role, John Rabe, a German businessman who had lived in China for nearly 30 years and was, improbably, a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. Rabe is one of history's stranger figures. In Germany, his party was building its own apparatus of horror. But in Nanking, this stout, middle-aged businessman with a swastika armband became the closest thing the city had to a protector. He worked tirelessly. He argued, negotiated, pleaded, and occasionally bullied Japanese officers. He sheltered refugees in his own garden. He kept a meticulous diary. That diary would become one of the most important historical documents of the massacre. Alongside Rabe was Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary and educator who ran Jinling Women's College, now part of Nanjing University. Vautrin was slight, soft-spoken, and utterly implacable. Her campus became a sanctuary for women fleeing the soldiers. At its peak, it sheltered 10,000 people. Her diary, too, would survive. Her entries, written in the trembling hours after confrontations with soldiers, after hearing screams on the other side of the gate, after pulling women from the hands of men with guns, are almost unbearable to read. These two people, and the others around them, were about to be tested in ways no human being should ever have to be tested. On December 9th, the Japanese commanders delivered an ultimatum to the Chinese garrison: surrender within 24 hours or face destruction. The garrison refused. The assault began. On December 12th, Chiang Kai-shek issued a general retreat order from his safe location upriver. But the order was poorly communicated, The command structure was dissolving, and the city's gates had been locked earlier to prevent mass desertion. Those gates, meant to keep soldiers from fleeing, now became walls of a trap. Tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers found themselves caught between the walls of the city and the advancing Japanese forces, with no way out and no coherent leadership. On December 13, 1937, the walls of Nanking were breached. The city had fallen, and what came next was not an occupation. It was a rampage. The first days. The soldiers who poured through the gates of Nanking on December 13th had been marching and fighting for months. They were tired, they were angry, and they had been shaped by a culture that viewed the Chinese as subhuman, by officers who had let weeks of escalating atrocity go unpunished, and by a specific set of orders. Those orders. There is significant historical debate about exactly what was said and by whom. But the weight of evidence, diary entries, military documents, testimonies, points to this. Somewhere in the chain of command, word was passed that prisoners were not to be taken, that captives should be killed. The order is most often linked to Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, the emperor's uncle, who had been placed in temporary command of the operation around this time, as General Matsui lay ill. Whether the order originated with Asaka, whether he simply passed it along, or whether it emerged from a culture that had already normalized mass killing, the effect was the same. The killing began almost immediately. The first targets were the tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers who had been trapped inside the city. They were disarmed. Some had shed their uniforms and mixed with the civilian population. Others were still in military dress. It didn't matter much. The Japanese conducted systematic sweeps, door to door, street by street, and any man of military age was suspect. Japanese soldiers developed a rough checklist. Calluses on the hands could mean a farmer, could mean a soldier. Marks on the shoulders from carrying a rifle, tan lines from a military cap, short hair. Any of these, or simply the wrong look in someone's eyes, could be a death sentence. But here is the crucial, damning detail that marks this not as the fog of war, but as something deliberate. Even men who clearly weren't soldiers were killed. Even civilians with no connection to the military were pulled from their homes and shot, bayonet, or beheaded. The search for soldiers became cover for something much broader. The killings were not always quick. They were often theatrical in their cruelty, as if the soldiers were performing their violence for an audience or competing with each other. New York Times correspondent Tilman Durden was one of the last Western journalists to leave the city, and what he witnessed as his boat pulled away from the Nanking docks on December 15th seared itself into his memory for the rest of his life. He described watching Japanese soldiers marching 200 Chinese captives to a wall near the waterfront and executing them in groups, systematically, without hesitation, as if it were routine. "I was a young reporter," he said later, "and it was my first big story. And I almost feel ashamed to say that I observed it with professional detachment. It was only afterward, when I had time to think about what I had seen, that the full horror hit me." Durden's dispatches to the Times were among the first accounts of the massacre to reach the outside world. But the world's attention was elsewhere. Japan was an ally of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, the emerging Axis powers. Western governments were trying to appease Hitler in Europe. The League of Nations had already proved toothless over Manchuria. And China, tragic and distant, was easy to overlook. The killing escalated. One of the most devastating events of those first days unfolded on the banks of the Yangtze River on December 18th, an event that would come to be called the String Gorge Massacre, though that name barely captures what happened. Thousands of prisoners, disarmed soldiers, and civilian men who had been swept up in the security dragnets were herded together. Their hands were bound with straw rope. They were marched to the riverside in groups so large that witnesses compared the columns to rivers of humanity flowing toward the water. At the banks, machine guns opened fire. The screaming lasted minutes. Then there was silence. Those who had survived the initial volley, wounded and struggling in the shallows, were bayoneted. The bodies, thousands of them, were pushed into the river. Witnesses downstream reported seeing the Yangtze running red. This was not a battle. There was no exchange of fire. These were unarmed, bound men, murdered in the cold, their bodies dumped like waste. And it was happening across the city, simultaneously, at scale. Inside the safety zone. Let's step back inside the walls of the safety zone. Because even here, in the one place that was supposed to offer protection, the horror was relentless, and the courage required to hold the line was extraordinary. Within days of the city's fall, the safety zone had swollen far beyond anything its organizers had anticipated. They had prepared for perhaps 200,000 people. By mid-December, the population was closer to 300,000, nearly the entire surviving civilian population of Nanking, crammed into 4 square kilometers. John Rabe's house, garden, and office compound had become a refugee camp in themselves, sheltering several hundred people. He wrote in his diary every night, long, detailed, increasingly desperate entries that chronicled what he was seeing. On December 16th, he wrote, "There is hardly a building in the zone that is not occupied by soldiers searching for loot or women." On December 17th, "We rescued a woman from the hands of 3 Japanese soldiers this afternoon." The language barrier made it almost impossible to communicate, so I simply placed myself between her and the soldiers and refused to move. He was a Nazi party member standing between a woman and soldiers of an allied nation, using his armband as a shield. The complexity of that image is almost too much to hold. The committee worked around the clock. Members would hear screaming and run toward it. They would find soldiers in the act of abducting women or executing men, and they would intervene, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. They documented everything, compiling daily reports and delivering formal complaints to the Japanese embassy and military headquarters. The Japanese commanders received these complaints, issued formal orders that their troops should respect the zone, and then did almost nothing to enforce those orders. Because the orders from above, the real orders, the ones being followed, said something very different. Many Vautrin's diary entries from these weeks are among the most harrowing documents I have ever read. She was a woman of deep faith, and you can see in her writing the struggle to reconcile what she believed about human beings with what she was watching happen right in front of her. December 17th. There is not a woman in the camp who has not trembled with fear these past 4 days. December 19th. Last night soldiers came over our walls 3 times. We caught them twice. Each time they had made their way to the area where the women sleep. She confronted soldiers directly, repeatedly, in darkness, with nothing but her presence and her American passport. She pulled women from soldiers' hands. She placed herself between a gun and a crowd. She was, by any definition, brave to the point of recklessness. And yet she also knew, and recorded in her diary, that she couldn't be everywhere at once. That soldiers came over the walls she wasn't watching. That women were taken in the night, in sections of the campus she couldn't reach in time. She saved thousands. and she was haunted forever by the ones she couldn't save. The scale of sexual violence in Nanking during these weeks is, I want to be direct with you, almost impossible to describe without retreating into clinical language that flattens what actually happened to real women. But that retreat is itself a kind of betrayal. So let me try to speak plainly. Rape was not an incidental feature of the Nanking Massacre. It was a central one. Estimates of the number of women who were assaulted range from 20,000 at the low end to 80,000. Those numbers represent real women, girls as young as 7, grandmothers in their 80s, women in their homes, in the safety zone, in temples, in government buildings converted to refugee camps. Soldiers moved through neighborhoods in groups. Families who tried to protect their daughters or wives were killed. Women who resisted were killed. Some women were held captive in military camps for days or weeks. Some were killed after the assault. Some took their own lives rather than endure continued captivity. An American doctor working in Nanking, a man named Robert Wilson, kept his own diary and later testified at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. He described the cases he treated, the injuries, with the specificity of a medical professional and the anguish of a human being. I cannot discuss what I have seen, he wrote at one point, because I do not have words that do not diminish it. The survivors of these assaults largely suffered in silence in the years and decades that followed, partly from shame, partly from cultural pressure, partly because Japan's post-war government was not exactly encouraging them to come forward. Many went to their graves without ever speaking publicly about what had happened. Some spoke only late in life, in the 1980s and 1990s, when Chinese scholars and journalists began actively seeking testimonies before it was too late. Their words, preserved in archives and documentary films, are the closest we have to the voices of Nanking, the faces of the massacre. History is always in danger of becoming abstraction. Numbers blur. Events merge. Cities become symbols rather than places where people lived and breathed and feared. So let me give you some names. Xia Shuqin was 8 years old on December 13, 1937. She lived in a house in Nanking with 9 members of her family, her parents, her grandmother, her 4 older sisters, and a 2-year-old younger sister. On the night of December 16th, Japanese soldiers entered their home. What happened next took only minutes. 7 of her 9 family members were killed. Her grandmother, her parents, her older sisters. Xia survived by hiding under a table, covered in her family's blood, not moving, not making a sound, while soldiers moved through the rooms around her. She was found the next day by a neighbor, still under the table, her younger sister beside her, both of them in shock. She lived to old age. She gave testimony to the Tokyo Tribunal. She appeared in documentaries. She was still alive in the early 2000s, still clear-eyed, still precise in her recollections, still carrying December 16th, 1937 inside her like a splinter that could never be removed. Sen Shuifeng was Minnie Vautrin's assistant at Jinling College. She spoke Japanese, which made her invaluable during confrontations with soldiers. Night after night, she translated Vautrin's protests to officers, negotiated, pleaded, bluffed. She was quieter in the historical record than Vautrin, less documented, less celebrated, but the women who survived at Jinling remembered her. She was the voice between them and the soldiers. Lu Fengzhu was a young man who had been a student before the war. He survived by hiding in the safety zone and later became one of the key witnesses at the Tokyo Tribunal. His testimony about what he saw at the Yangtze riverbank, the executions, the bodies, the water, helped convict some of the men responsible. Reverend James McCallum, an American missionary, kept a diary that was both meticulous and increasingly shattered. A man of faith confronting an event that tested faith to its absolute limits. He wrote with painful simplicity, "I wonder when it will all end. I wonder if it will ever end." And then there is the figure of John McGee, an Episcopal minister who did something that changed history. McGee had a 16mm film camera, and in the weeks after the city fell, he used it quietly, carefully, at enormous personal risk to document what he was seeing. Executions, destroyed buildings, the injured who made it to safety. And then, in the hospital rooms where Robert Wilson was working, the survivors, people who could not speak for themselves because their injuries were too severe, filmed so that there would be a record that no one could later call a lie. McGee's footage, roughly 4 hours of it, was smuggled out of China piece by piece. It became crucial evidence at the Tokyo Tribunal. Copies were hidden in multiple locations. Today, fragments of it survive in archives around the world. When revisionist historians in Japan have claimed in subsequent decades that the massacre was exaggerated or fabricated, McGee's footage is one of the things they cannot explain away. It is not a text that can be disputed or reinterpreted. It is moving images of what happened, filmed by a man who was there. 6 weeks. The most intense period of mass killing lasted from mid-December 1937 through the end of January 1938. 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, the pattern of violence was remarkably consistent. Mornings often brought new sweeps through the civilian population, soldiers searching for suspected soldiers, looting homes, dragging people from their hiding places. Afternoons saw mass executions at the river's edge, in ditches outside the city walls, in vacant lots. Nights brought soldiers over the walls of the safety zone. The International Committee compiled reports and sent them daily to the Japanese military command. Hundreds of documented incidents. Formal complaints, formal protests, formal demands that the violence stop. The Japanese military command acknowledged receiving these reports, issued statements saying the army would be brought under control. And then, nothing. Because there was no one in the Japanese chain of command who wanted to stop what was happening. The soldiers were doing what soldiers in this army, under these conditions, had been conditioned to do. The officers were either participating or looking away. The High Command was focused on the strategic prize. Nanking was taken, the capital was occupied, and the details of what was happening on the ground were not, apparently, a concern. This tells us something important. What happened in Nanking was not the result of individual soldiers who went rogue. It was institutional. It was enabled. It was, at some level, intended. That doesn't mean every Japanese soldier who entered Nanking committed atrocities. Some did not. There are documented cases of Japanese soldiers who protected civilians, who disobeyed orders, who were visibly horrified by what their comrades were doing. These exceptions were rare, but they existed. And they matter because they prove that choice was possible, that men could say no, even in that situation. Most did not say no. By late January 1938, the most intensive wave of killings had subsided, partly because there were fewer men left to kill, partly because the army was needed elsewhere, partly because the presence of the foreign community and their persistent documentation was creating enough international scrutiny to become inconvenient. In February, the Japanese military declared order had been restored. They forced the International Committee to disband the safety zone. Rabe and most of the other foreigners eventually left. Their time in Nanking was over. Behind them, they left a city that was barely recognizable. More than a third of the buildings had been burned. The infrastructure was shattered. Mass graves dotted the outskirts of the city, some of them hastily dug, others just open pits. The men and women who stayed behind, the survivors, had to begin the unimaginable task of reconstructing their lives in a city that had become a cemetery. The reckoning that never quite came. After Japan's defeat in August 1945, the Allied powers established the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo Trials, the Pacific equivalent of the Nuremberg Trials. For 2.5 years, judges from 11 Allied nations heard testimony about Japanese war crimes across Asia. Nanking was a central focus. Survivors testified. Former soldiers testified. The foreign witnesses, Rabe, Vautrin, Wilson, McGee, provided diaries, medical records, and film footage. The evidence was overwhelming, extensive, irrefutable. The tribunal concluded that at least 200,000 civilians and prisoners of war had been killed in Nanking during the massacre. That figure was a conservative estimate. The tribunal acknowledged that the full scale of the killing might never be fully known. Convictions followed. General Iwane Matsui, the overall commander of the Central China Area Army, was found guilty and executed in 1948, not for ordering the massacre, but for a lesser charge, dereliction of duty and failing to prevent it. Matsui had reportedly wept when he returned to Nanking in early January and saw what his army had done. He had issued orders that the violence must stop, but by then it was too late, and his earlier failure to impose discipline was held against him. Lieutenant General Tani Hisao, who had personally participated in killings and ordered atrocities, was extradited to China, tried separately, convicted, and executed in 1947. Other officers received prison sentences. But the man most directly responsible, the man whose order is most often cited as the trigger for the worst of the killing, faced no consequences at all. Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, Emperor Hirohito's uncle, the commander on the ground during the massacre's worst days. The man from whose headquarters the order to kill all captives is believed to have originated. He was never charged. The decision was made by General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied occupation of Japan. MacArthur believed, and he was not entirely wrong, that trying members of the imperial family would destabilize Japan's post-war transition, that it could trigger a backlash, possibly reignite resistance, possibly complicate the American goal of turning Japan into a stable, democratic ally against the Soviet Union. So a deal was struck. The emperor himself was shielded from prosecution. Members of the imperial family were granted immunity. Prince Asaka was stripped of his royal title and his property, the standard demilitarization that applied to everyone. But he was never brought before a court. He moved to a quiet suburb outside Tokyo. He took up golf. He played in amateur tournaments. He gave occasional interviews, in which he expressed no remorse. Indeed, barely acknowledged that anything unusual had happened in Nanking. He died in 1981. He was 93 years old. He never spent a day in prison. That fact is not a footnote. For the survivors of Nanking, and for the descendants of those who died there, it is an open wound. Justice was not denied, it was simply never sought. And then came the revisionism. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and prospered and became a key American ally and then a global economic powerhouse, a particular version of history began to take hold in certain circles. A version that minimized, that quibbled, that questioned. Ultranationalist historians in Japan began writing books arguing that the Nanking Massacre was exaggerated, fabricated, or outright invented. Chinese propaganda designed to embarrass Japan. They pointed to disputed figures in the death toll as evidence that the whole event was suspect. They noted inconsistencies in some witness testimonies, the kinds of inconsistencies that are inevitable when trauma survivors try to recall precise details decades later and use them to cast doubt on everything. Some Japanese history textbooks soften the language around Nanking, using vague phrases like the Nanking incident and omitting the scale of the atrocities. These textbooks were adopted in schools. A generation of young Japanese people grew up with a blurred or absent picture of what their country had done. This denial caused, and continues to cause, immense pain in China. It is one of the central fault lines in the relationship between the two countries. Every few years, a Japanese politician makes a statement minimizing the massacre, or a textbook revision softens the language, and the diplomatic relationship lurches into crisis. The survivors, in their old age, watched this denial and felt something that is very hard to name. It is not quite anger. It is something heavier. The feeling of having survived something almost unsurvivable, of having carried the weight of it for decades, and then being told, by the country that did it to you, that perhaps it wasn't so bad. Perhaps it barely happened. But the ones who saved lives. But I want to spend a few minutes on the people who held the line, because their stories deserve to be told fully, not just as supporting characters in a story about horror. John Rabe left Nanking in February 1938. He returned to Germany and tried to get the Nazi government to pressure Japan. His report to Hitler was forwarded to the Foreign Ministry, which politely ignored it. He was eventually investigated by the Gestapo, who considered his writings about Japan politically embarrassing. He was ordered not to publish or speak about Nanking. After the war, he was arrested and investigated 3 times under denazification procedures, which was fair, given his party membership, and each time his conduct in Nanking was weighed in his favor. He was ultimately cleared, but the post-war years were hard. Germany was in ruins, the economy was shattered, and Rabe struggled. He was impoverished, sick, and barely surviving. When news of his situation reached Nanking, the city he had helped save, the response was remarkable. The citizens of Nanjing raised money for him. Food packages were sent. A small stipend was organized. The man who had sheltered hundreds of Chinese refugees in his garden was, in the end, kept alive by their gratitude. He died in 1950. His diary, which his family had kept, was rediscovered in the 1990s and published, becoming a foundational document for understanding the massacre. Minnie Vautrin could not carry the weight she had taken on. She stayed in Nanking through 1940, continuing her work at Jinling College. But the trauma had settled into her like rot into wood, invisible from the outside, fatal from within. In the spring of 1940, she had a severe mental breakdown. Her colleagues arranged for her to return to the United States. In May 1941, less than a year after leaving Nanking, Minnie Vautrin died by suicide. She was 54 years old. Among her papers was a line from her diary that has been quoted many times since. I'll paraphrase it rather than quote directly. She wrote that if she had 10 perfect lives, she would give them all to China. She gave the only one she had. Today, Minnie Vautrin is honored at Nanjing University, on the campus that was once Jinling College. Her portrait hangs there. Students pass under it every day. What we owe to memory. The Nanking Massacre Memorial Hall was built in 1985 on one of the mass grave sites outside the city. It has been expanded several times since. Today, it receives millions of visitors a year: Chinese students on school trips, tourists from around the world, elderly survivors who come to find the names of the people they lost etched into the walls. The official Chinese figure for the death toll, 300,000, is inscribed at the entrance. That number is contested by some scholars, who put the figure lower. But even the most conservative academic estimates conclude that at least 100,000 people were killed, perhaps 200,000. The range matters far less than the certainty that what happened here was a crime against humanity on a vast scale. And yet here we are, nearly 90 years later, still arguing about it, still watching politicians make statements that minimize it, still seeing textbooks that omit it, still hearing the voices of survivors ignored or dismissed. Why does this happen? Why does a nation that is in many ways modern, sophisticated, and peaceful continue to struggle with the acknowledgement of what its army did? Part of the answer is political. Acknowledging the full scope of the massacre would complicate certain narratives about the war, about Japan's role in Asia, about national identity. But I think there's something deeper, too, something more human. It is very hard to look directly at the worst thing your country has done. It is much easier to squint, to soften, to look away. Germany, to its enormous credit, has mostly resisted this temptation when it comes to the Holocaust. The process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, has been painful and imperfect, but it has been real. Germany teaches the Holocaust to its children. It maintains the memorials. It criminalizes denial. Japan has not done this with Nanking. Not fully. Not yet. And until it does, the wound stays open. I want to end not with geopolitics, but with people. Xia Shuqin, who hid under a table at 8 years old and came out alive. John Rabe, who put his body between soldiers and civilians because it was the right thing to do, regardless of what the armband on his sleeve said about the man who wore it. Minnie Vautrin, who gave everything she had to keep 10,000 women safe, and who was destroyed by what she couldn't prevent. The unnamed woman whose story Rabe captured in a single diary entry, rescued from 3 soldiers by a German businessman who simply refused to move. The men who were marched to the river in the cold, their hands bound with straw rope, who had names and families and histories that we will never know. They deserve more than horror. They deserve witnesses. To witness something is to refuse to let it disappear. It is to say, this happened. These people existed. What was done to them was real, and it was wrong, and we will not look away. The Nanking Massacre happened. 100,000 people, 200,000 people, 300,000 people. However the historians finally settle the number, they were real. They were not symbols or statistics or political arguments. They were people, and this is their story. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know why it matters. Share it with someone who doesn't. History this important shouldn't stay buried in an algorithm. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that are too heavy to forget and too important to ignore, subscribe. We'll be here every week, telling the ones that need to be told.